The Third Crusade, a saga of blood and honor. The scorching summer winds howled across the plains of Hattin on that fateful day in July 1187. Swirling dust occasionally obscured vision, but nothing could veil the determination of Saladin, standing tall as he surveyed the movements of his vast army encircling the Crusaders from all sides. He knew this battle would alter the course of history. On the opposing side, King Guy of Lusignan sweated profusely beneath his heavy armor. His men were exhausted after a grueling march under the relentless July sun with little water. "Where are the springs?" rasped one of his knights, but no one had an answer. Saladin had sealed off every escape route. When the war drums sounded, the plains of Hattin transformed into an unbearable hellfire. Flaming Muslim arrows pierced Crusader ranks as heavily armored knights collapsed one after another from thirst and exhaustion. "Protect the king," shouted a nobleman, but it was too late. By nightfall, the defeat was absolute. Saladin sat in his lavish tent watching shackled prisoners of war being brought before him. When King Guy was presented, he treated him with respect, ordering chilled water for the defeated monarch. But when Reynold of Chatillon, the rebellious prince, was dragged in, Saladin did not hesitate. He executed the man with his own sword, fulfilling his vow of vengeance for Reynold's repeated atrocities. Weeks later, Muslim armies stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The city, held by Crusaders for 88 years, was on the brink of falling. Inside, panic spread among the Christian inhabitants who remembered the massacre their ancestors had suffered when the Crusaders first took the city in 1099. Yet Saladin stunned everyone. Upon his victorious entry, he issued strict orders prohibiting looting or killing. He allowed all Christians to leave safely after paying a nominal ransom, even paying from his own treasury for the poor. This act of mercy astonished friend and foe alike, becoming legendary in both Christian and Islamic lands. In Europe, news of Jerusalem's fall struck like thunder. Pope Gregory VIII, an elderly man on his deathbed, issued a papal bull declaring the loss of the Holy City divine punishment for Christian sins. "It is God's will that we reclaim what was lost," he proclaimed before breathing his last. His successor, Pope Clement III, took up the torch, calling for a new crusade. But this time, motives weren't purely religious. Europe's great kings saw in this campaign a golden opportunity to expand their power and glory. Frederick Barbarossa, the 70-year-old Holy Roman Emperor, sought a final glorious achievement to cement his legacy. Philip II Augustus, the cunning young king of France, aimed to prove his superiority over rivals. And Richard the Lionheart, England's reckless monarch, dreamed of becoming a legend for the ages. In May 1189, the German armies under Barbarossa launched the first wave of the crusade. It was a majestic sight, 100,000 soldiers crossing into Hungary toward Constantinople. But fate had a cruel surprise in store for the aged emperor. At the Salah River in Anatolia, as Barbarossa crossed on horseback, the unthinkable happened. His steed stumbled, throwing him into the raging currents. Moments of panic ensued before the old emperor disappeared beneath the churning waters. His men searched for hours but found only his crimson cloak floating on the surface. Barbarossa's death dealt the crusade a crushing blow. The mighty German force scattered like dust in the wind. Only a handful of knights under his son Frederick of Swabia pressed on, arriving in the Holy Land exhausted and diminished. By summer 1190, English and French ships began arriving at Acre's shores. The city had been under Crusader siege for over a year, but its formidable defenses made it an impregnable puzzle. Richard the Lionheart, resplendent in gilded armor and red insignia, was first to disembark. Soldiers flocked to him, some even kneeling as if before a saint. Philip II Augustus, arriving days later, scowled at his rival's grand reception. The French royal tent was less ornate but no less luxurious. Philip sat swirling wine in his goblet. "He wants all glory for himself," he whispered to an advisor, gesturing toward Richard's lavish pavilion. The siege of Acre became a humanitarian catastrophe as months dragged on. Crusaders tunneled under walls while defenders poured boiling oil on attackers. Corpses piled up around the fortifications until the stench of death permeated everything. One moonless night, Richard led a band of knights through a ruined tower. The close-quarters combat in utter darkness was brutal. His golden sword flashed intermittently in stray moonlight, leaving fallen enemies in its wake. After 2 grueling years, Acre finally fell in July 1191. Richard raised his banners atop the highest towers while Philip watched from afar, eyes burning with resentment. "He's done it alone before the world's eyes," murmured a French noble. Tensions between the kings escalated in following weeks. Philip demanded equal spoils, but Richard refused vehemently. "We paid for this victory in blood, I'll take what I'm owed," he declared arrogantly. Then one morning, the French king was gone. Philip had slipped away secretly, leaving only vague word of urgent matters at home. In truth, he was plotting to seize Richard's Norman lands in his absence. Now sole commander, Richard marched south toward Jaffa and Jerusalem. Saladin monitored his every move, knowing Richard feared nothing, but also that he was reckless. At Arsuf in September 1191, the Titans clashed. Muslim forces attacked the Crusader rearguard fiercely, nearly breaking their lines. For a moment, victory seemed Saladin's, but Richard the Lionheart would not accept defeat. With rare tactical brilliance, he rallied his men under pressure. "Jerusalem lies ahead, hell behind us," he roared before leading a devastating countercharge. The Crusader knights, led by Richard, cut through Muslim ranks like a hot knife through butter. Saladin was forced to retreat with heavy losses, his first clear defeat in years. After Arsuf, the road to Jerusalem lay open. By December 1191, Richard's forces gazed upon the holy city's walls. Some soldiers knelt weeping in gratitude, others cheered wildly. Yet Richard, standing on a hill overlooking Jerusalem, hesitated. The towering walls and formidable defenses gave him pause. "If we take the city, how will we hold it?" he asked his advisors. "Our forces are few, our supplies scant." At the War Council, opinions divided. Some urged immediate attack while others warned of the risks. Finally, Richard made the hardest choice: retreat. "I won't sacrifice my men for an impossible dream," he said bitterly. The year 1192 saw grueling negotiations between Richard and Saladin. In September, they signed the Treaty of Jaffa. Muslims retained Jerusalem but granted Christians pilgrimage rights, while Crusaders kept a coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. As Richard left the Holy Land, he tasted the bitterness of failure. Worse awaited. In Vienna, Duke Leopold captured and handed him to the German emperor. The ransom demanded was staggering: 150,000 silver marks, triple England's annual income. Saladin, meanwhile, fell mysteriously ill months after the crusade ended. His physicians were baffled. In March 1193, he died in Damascus. His funeral was simple as requested, yet mourners wept from Egypt to Iraq. The Third Crusade left many questions. Was it success or failure? Some saw Saladin victorious for keeping Jerusalem, others credited Richard with a moral victory by preserving the Crusader foothold. In truth, both men ultimately lost. Richard returned to England broken, only to die years later in a meaningless skirmish. Saladin died alone, his empire beginning to fragment without him. Jerusalem, the city for which so much blood was spilled, remained beyond Crusader reach. Yet the tales of heroism and betrayal, nobility, and cruelty from those 3 years endured, passed down through generations as legends never forgotten. The scorching winds still blow across Hattin's plains, whispering of that fateful day when two civilizations clashed, and of the extraordinary men whose ambitions, flaws, and fleeting glories shaped our world. Their story remains, as Saladin himself once said, written not in ink, but in the blood of brave men. The Third Crusade, an epic of blood and sanctity. The scorching July sun blazed over the plains of Hattin, leaving the air thick with dust and the stench of fear. Saladin stood atop a high hill, his piercing eyes tracking the movements of his army as they encircled the Crusaders like wolves closing in on their prey. His black beard rippled in the hot wind, and his sword, Dhu al-Fakar, hung at his waist, glinting in the sunlight as if thirsting for battle. In that moment, he knew history was about to change forever. In the Crusader camp, King Guy of Lusignan gasped under the weight of his heavy armor. "Water, give us water," a knight croaked, but no one answered. Saladin had cut off every escape route, turning the plain into a blazing furnace. The Crusaders' horses stumbled from exhaustion, and their swords grew too heavy to lift. When the cries of Allahu Akbar rang out, the plains of Hattin became hell on earth. Muslim arrows, tipped with burning pitch, pierced Crusader ranks as their horses tripped over the bodies of their fallen comrades. "Protect the king," shouted a nobleman, but his voice was lost in the roar of battle. By dusk, the ground was covered in a sea of blood and steel, the stench of death hanging thick in the air. Inside Saladin's lavish tent, prisoners were led in chains. When King Guy was brought before him, Saladin ordered chilled water for the defeated monarch. But when Reinald of Chatillon, the rebellious prince, entered, the Sultan did not hesitate to fulfill his oath. "I warned you many times," Saladin whispered as he raised his sword. A single stroke was enough to end the life of the man who had tormented Muslims with his treachery. Weeks later, the Muslim army stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The city, held by the Crusaders for 88 years, was on the brink of falling. Inside, panic spread among the Christian inhabitants, who remembered the massacre of their ancestors in 1099. But Saladin surprised them all. Upon entering the city, he issued strict orders forbidding looting or reprisals. "This is holy land for all," he told his aides as he watched Christian families depart safely after paying a nominal ransom. In Europe, news of Jerusalem's fall struck like a thunderbolt. Pope Gregory VIII, an old man on his deathbed, insisted on issuing a papal bull before dying. "It is God's will that we reclaim what was lost." But Europe's kings had other concerns besides religion. Frederick Barbarossa, the 70-year-old Holy Roman Emperor, sought a final achievement to immortalize his name. Philip II, the young King of France, schemed to expand his power. And Richard the Lionheart cared only for personal glory that history would remember. When Barbarossa drowned in the Salah River, the German campaign turned to disaster. His great army scattered like autumn leaves, and only a handful of soldiers, led by his son, reached the Holy Land. In Acre, where the Crusaders had besieged the city for 2 years, everything had become a nightmare. Corpses rotted beneath the walls, and the stench of death hung over the place. Richard, in his golden armor and red insignia, led assaults personally, while Philip sat in his tent, plotting schemes. On the night Acre fell, Richard slipped through a breach in the walls with a band of knights. The fighting was face-to-face in pitch darkness. His golden sword flashed intermittently, leaving fallen enemies in its wake. When he raised his banners over the city walls, Philip watched from afar with eyes full of hatred. "He did it alone," whispered a French nobleman. Betrayal came swiftly. Philip suddenly departed for France, leaving behind a vague message. But Richard knew the truth: his rival was returning to steal his lands. Now, he was the sole leader of a doomed campaign. On the plains of Arsuf, Richard faced Saladin in an epic battle. The Muslim army struck the Crusader rear with such force that victory seemed certain. But Richard turned the tide with masterful tactics. "Jerusalem lies ahead, hell behind us," he roared before leading a devastating countercharge. Saladin, for the first time in years, was forced to retreat. When Richard finally stood on a hill overlooking Jerusalem, he felt something strange. The holy city lay before him, but its towering walls gave him pause. "If we take it, how will we hold it?" he asked his advisors. In the end, he made the hardest decision: withdrawal. "I will not sacrifice my men for an impossible dream," he said bitterly. The Treaty of Ramla was a tragic conclusion. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christians were granted pilgrimage rights. Richard left the Holy Land defeated, but worse awaited him: captivity in Europe, then death in a meaningless skirmish. Saladin died months later, alone in his Damascus palace. The Third Crusade left behind harsh lessons. Jerusalem remained a dream, and the blood spilled had washed away nothing but pride. Yet the tales of heroism and betrayal from those days endured, passed down through generations as a warning that holy wars rarely produce anything holy. The scorching winds still blow across Atene, whispering of the day when two worlds clashed, and of the men whose ambitions, flaws, and fleeting glories shaped history. Their story lives on, as Saladin himself once said, written not in ink, but in the blood of the brave. The Lion's Crusade, Richard the Lionheart and the Third Crusade. The Mediterranean sun burned white-hot in the summer sky as Richard Plantagenet's fleet cut through the waves toward the besieged city of Acre. The English king stood motionless at the prow of his flagship, his calloused hands gripping the rail as the salt spray stung his sun-weathered face. Behind him, nearly 100 ships carried the flower of English and Norman chivalry, hardened warriors who had followed their king across Europe to this holy war. The crimson cloak that earned Richard his famous nickname billowed behind him like a living banner, its golden lions snapping in the sea wind, as the coastline of Outremer came into view. Richard's piercing blue eyes that had stared down death in a dozen battles, studied the distant smudge of smoke marking Acre's position. The siege had dragged on for 2 miserable years, reducing what was once the jewel of the Levant to a stinking, corpse-strewn wasteland. Even from miles out at sea, Richard could smell the reek of death and decay carried on the offshore breeze. It was the stench of failed crusades, of broken promises, of Christian blood spilled without purpose. Below deck, the king's trusted lieutenants prepared for landing. William de Bars, the greatest French knight of their age, checked his armor for the 100th time. Robert de Sable, soon to be Grand Master of the Templars, sharpened his sword with methodical strokes. Richard's loyal squire, a boy barely 16, polished the king's great war axe hilt until its curved blade gleamed like silver. They all knew what awaited them, not the glorious liberation they had dreamed of in Europe, but a brutal war of attrition against an enemy who had already broken 3 Crusader armies. The fleet's arrival sent shockwaves through both camps. In the Christian siege lines, starving soldiers wept at the sight of fresh troops and supplies. In Saladin's camp beyond the hills, scouts raced to inform the Sultan that the legendary Lionheart had come at last. That first night ashore, Richard summoned his commanders to a torchlit council on the beach. The flickering flames cast monstrous shadows as the king outlined his strategy: no more cautious probing, no more half-hearted assaults. They would take Acre by storm, and God help any man who faltered. Dawn revealed the true horror of the siege. The plains before Acre's walls were a charnel house where the dead lay unburied for weeks. Rotting corpses formed grotesque mounds where crows and rats held ghastly feasts. The stench was so overpowering that men tied vinegar-soaked cloths over their faces. Richard walked among this devastation with grim determination, his boots sticking in the blood-soaked mud as he inspected the siege works. The king's presence electrified the demoralized crusaders. Where the French had built their engines of war from green wood that cracked under strain, Richard's English engineers brought seasoned oak from home. Where previous assaults had been disorganized rushes, Richard drilled his men in coordinated attacks. Each morning found him personally inspecting the trenches, often helping to push siege towers into position alongside common soldiers. At night, he walked among the campfires, sharing wine and stories with his men in fluent French, Latin, and the Occitan tongue of his Aquitaine domains. The assault that finally broke Acre's defenses began in the pre-dawn darkness of July 12, 1191. Richard had ordered complete silence, no war cries, no trumpets. His crossbowmen, the finest in Christendom, crept forward under cover of new siege towers reinforced with raw hides against Greek fire. When the first streaks of dawn painted the eastern sky, a single flaming arrow arched over the walls. Richard's signal, hell itself, seemed to break loose as hundreds of bolts hissed through the morning air. Muslim defenders toppled from the ramparts like broken dolls. The siege towers disgorged streams of armored knights onto the battlements where brutal hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Richard was everywhere at once, hauling on ropes to raise ladders, rallying faltering troops, and finally leading the breakthrough charge himself. His great axe hilt rose and fell in terrible arcs, shearing through mail and bone alike. By midday, the banners of England and the Crusade flew over Acre's main tower. The victory feast that night was a tense affair. King Philip of France, who had arrived shortly before Richard, watched sullenly as the English king received the accolades. The two monarchs barely spoke, their mutual loathing barely concealed behind the rituals of chivalry. When Philip abruptly announced his departure for France weeks later, Richard knew it was no mere homesickness. The French king meant to exploit his absence to seize Plantagenet lands. With Acre secured, Richard turned his attention south toward Jaffa and the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. The march along the coast became a masterpiece of medieval warfare. Richard organized his army with meticulous care, Templars and Hospitallers forming the vanguard and rearguard, his fleet shadowing their progress to provide supplies. Each night, the king personally inspected the camp's defenses, often standing watch himself when he sensed unease among the men. Saladin's forces shadowed the Crusader host like wolves, testing their discipline with constant harassing attacks. Richard maintained iron control, forbidding his knights from breaking ranks to pursue the swift Muslim horsemen. The test came on September 7 near Arsuf, where Saladin committed his full army to battle. The morning of Arsuf dawned hot and still. Richard's army marched through dense orchards when suddenly the air filled with the shrieks of Saracen war cries. Thousands of mounted archers poured from the trees, their arrows darkening the sky. The Hospitaller knights, forming the rear guard, begged to countercharge as their horses screamed in agony from the arrow storm. Richard, his face streaked with sweat and dust, refused. Only when the Muslim forces became overconfident and pressed too close did he give the signal. With a blast of trumpets that echoed across the plain, the entire Crusader army pivoted as one. Richard, mounted on his massive destrier Fauvel, led the charge with his golden crown gleaming atop his helmet. The impact of several thousand armored knights shattered Saladin's lines completely. Richard's axe claimed dozens of victims as he carved a path toward the enemy command group. By dusk, the field belonged to the Crusaders, the first and only full-scale defeat Saladin would suffer against a Crusader army. The victory at Arsuf opened the road to Jaffa, which fell after a brief siege. Richard spent weeks rebuilding its shattered defenses, often working alongside stonemasons and carpenters. His hands became as rough as any laborer's, though he still wore his royal silks when receiving embassies from across the Levant. The king's paradoxical nature, both regal monarch and common soldier, inspired fierce loyalty among his amis. As winter approached, the crusade reached its critical juncture at Beit Nuba, a mere 12 miles from Jerusalem. The holy city was within their grasp, but Richard saw what others refused to acknowledge. Even if they took Jerusalem, they lacked the men to hold it against Saladin's still formidable forces. The supply lines stretched precariously back to Jaffa, vulnerable to Saracen raids. On a rain-swept January day in 1192, Richard made the most difficult decision of his life, to withdraw. The army's disappointment was palpable. Many knights wept openly, some accused Richard of cowardice. The king bore these insults in silence, knowing the truth in his heart. That night, alone in his tent, he was said to have covered his face with his cloak to hide his own tears. Jerusalem, the dream that had drawn him across continents, would remain beyond reach. In the months that followed, Richard pursued an unconventional strategy. He rebuilt castles along the coast, securing a defensible corridor for future crusaders. Most remarkably, he proposed marrying his sister Joan to Saladin's brother Al-Adil, with the couple to jointly rule Jerusalem, a visionary peace plan that shocked both Christians and Muslims. Though the proposal came to nothing, it revealed Richard's pragmatic understanding of the Holy Land's complex politics. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, represented a compromise. Christians would retain control of the coast and have access to Jerusalem, but the Holy City remained under Muslim rule. Richard, exhausted by years of campaigning and troubled by news of his brother John's scheming back in England, set sail for home. As his ship pulled away from Acres Harbor, Richard stood alone at the stern, watching the city's towers fade into the haze. He had come to liberate Jerusalem, but would return having secured only a strip of coastline. Yet in those 3 years, he had forged something more enduring than territory, a legend that would echo through the ages. The Lionheart had roared in Palestine, and even in partial failure, his voice would never be forgotten. Richard's true legacy lay not in lands conquered, but in how he transformed crusading warfare. His bold tactics, personal bravery, and chivalric ideals became the standard by which all future crusaders would be measured. Though Jerusalem remained unconquered, Richard had given the Crusader states a fighting chance, a legacy that would endure long after his death on another battlefield far from the Holy Land he had fought so hard to reclaim. The Third Crusade revealed Richard at his best and worst, a peerless battlefield commander who nevertheless failed to achieve his ultimate objective. His temper led to needless massacres like the execution of Acres garrison, while his political naivety alienated potential allies. Yet his genuine piety, courage under fire, and willingness to share his men's hardships created a legend that transcended mere military results. In the end, Richard the Lionheart's crusade was like the man himself, brilliant yet flawed, magnificent yet incomplete. The Holy Land would never again see his like, a king who could inspire men to follow him into hell itself, not for land or gold, but for the sheer glory of the fight. The lion's last roar. Richard and Saladin at Ramla. The Mediterranean sun hung like a molten coin over the plains of Ramla, baking the blood-soaked earth where 2 years of holy war had raged. On this late September afternoon in 1192, the air shimmered with heat and unspoken tension as two of history's most formidable warriors prepared to end their crusade. Richard Plantagenet, the Lionheart of England, stood a head taller than most of his knights, his sunburned face framed by golden hair bleached nearly white from years under the Palestinian sun. His famous crimson cloak, the one that had given him his nickname, billowed behind him like a banner of war, its embroidered lions frayed from countless battles. The once gleaming plate armor he wore showed the scars of combat, dents from Saracen maces, blackened patches from Greek fire, and dark stains that no amount of polishing could remove. Across the field, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub sat cross-legged on an ornate Persian carpet, his simple woolen robes a stark contrast to Richard's martial splendor. At 54, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body bore the toll of constant campaigning. His close-cropped beard showed more gray than black now, and the lines around his dark eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent poring over maps and supply lists. The curved shamshir at his waist remained sheathed, but every one of his Mamluks knew their leader could draw it faster than most men could blink. Between these two titans stretched a no-man's land of shattered dreams and broken bodies. The trampled earth still held fragments of Crusader swords and Muslim arrowheads, the detritus of 3 brutal campaigning seasons. Here and there, patches of ground showed darker than the rest, places where so much blood had soaked into the soil that nothing would grow for years to come. The stench of death still lingered despite the best efforts of burial details from both armies. Inside the lavish negotiation tent, a vast pavilion of crimson silk embroidered with golden calligraphy, the air hung heavy with the scent of sandalwood and something sharper, more metallic. Richard's massive two-handed battle axe Holt leaned against his ornately carved chair, its crescent-shaped blade still bearing the nicks and stains from the massacre at Acre. Saladin's simpler seat held a cushion stuffed with aromatic herbs to ease his chronic back pain, a legacy of decades in the saddle. Between them stood a low table bearing a detailed map of the Holy Land, its vellum surface covered with wine stains and dagger marks from previous heated discussions. Translators hovered like nervous sparrows at the edges of the tent, their faces glistening with sweat despite the shade. These Syrian Christian and Jewish interpreters knew better than anyone how a single mistranslated word could turn this fragile truce into renewed slaughter. The fate of kingdoms rested on their ability to render fortress and sanctuary with perfect precision. You ask for Jerusalem? Saladin's quiet Arabic carried surprising weight in the hushed tent. His calloused fingers, equally adept at wielding a pen or sword, traced the intricate geometric patterns on his brass coffee cup as he waited for the translation. The Sultan's voice remained calm, but his dark eyes burned with intensity. After the rivers your people spilled within its walls in 1099? Richard's gauntlet fist clenched around his jeweled goblet with enough force to dent the precious metal. The Angevin temper, legendary throughout Christendom, flared in his ice-blue eyes. I didn't cross 3 kingdoms and 2 seas for real estate, he growled in Norman French, his voice roughened by years of battlefield commands. My brother knights didn't die for property lines. Outside the tent, the two armies waited in uneasy silence. Crusader knights polished already gleaming armor to calm their nerves, while Saladin's elite Mamluks recited verses from the Quran under their breath. The tension was palpable enough to taste metallic, like licking a sword blade. In the Christian camp, a grizzled Templar sergeant named Renaud of Provence tested the edge of his dagger for the 20th time that hour. If the Saracens break faith, he muttered to his companion, letting the threat hang unfinished. Nearby, a young squire from Aquitaine vomited nervously behind a supply cart, his body trembling with memories of the slaughter at Arsuf. Across the field in the Muslim lines, a Kurdish archer named Tariq al-Rahmani carefully fletched new arrows while keeping one eye on the negotiation tent. His brother had fallen defending Jerusalem's walls, and the thought of surrendering the city now made his hands shake. Beside him, an Egyptian physician named Yusuf ibn Abbas prepared poultices and bandages, knowing full well they might be needed before sunset. Back in the tent, the negotiations continued through gritted teeth and measured words. Richard demanded Christian control of Jerusalem's holy sites. Saladin countered with guaranteed pilgrimage rights but no sovereignty. The discussion of coastal fortresses nearly came to blows when Richard slammed his fist on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups dance. As afternoon faded toward evening, the true cost of this war became evident in the faces of the two leaders. Richard's once youthful features now showed deep lines of strain around his mouth and eyes. A livid scar from a Saracen arrow marred his left cheekbone, pulling slightly at his eyelid to give him a permanent squint. Saladin, for his part, moved with the careful precision of a man whose joints ached constantly. His famous tolerance for fasting was beginning to fail him, and his physicians worried about the persistent cough that sometimes brought up blood. The translators worked feverishly as the discussion turned to the fate of captured soldiers. Richard insisted on the release of all Christian prisoners. Saladin demanded reciprocity for Muslim captives. The haggling continued as the sun dipped below the horizon, servants lighting ornate brass lamps to illuminate the tense proceedings. Beyond the tent walls, the sounds of both armies preparing for either celebration or renewed slaughter carried through the cooling night air. Blacksmiths worked their forges late into the evening, repairing armor and sharpening blades just in case. Cook fires sent spirals of smoke into the violet twilight, the smell of roasting meat doing little to mask the ever-present stench of death. In a nearby village caught between the lines, the local inhabitants watched the proceedings with wary eyes. A Palestinian potter named Miriam Bat Eliezer peered through her shuttered window at the distant glow of the negotiation tent. Her husband had been killed in the crossfire during the battle for Jaffa, and her teenage son now walked with a limp from a Crusader arrow. She cared little for kings and sultans, only that the fighting might stop before she lost what remained of her family. As midnight approached, the two leaders finally reached an agreement that neither loved but both could accept. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would have safe passage to visit the holy sites. The coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa would remain in Crusader hands, while inland strongpoints would be dismantled. Prisoners would be exchanged, and a 3-year truce sworn on both their gods. When the terms were announced at dawn, the reaction split along predictable lines. Among Saladin's forces, quiet prayers of thanks to Allah mingled with muttered discontent from those who wanted total victory. In the Crusader camp, some knights wept openly at the thought of leaving Jerusalem in Muslim hands, while others quietly rejoiced at surviving the campaign. The most telling moment came when Richard, fulfilling a personal vow, entered Jerusalem as an unarmed pilgrim rather than a conqueror. Dressed in simple penitent's robes, the Lionheart walked the Via Dolorosa with head bowed, his famous sword left behind in Jaffa. Saladin, showing the magnanimity that had become legendary, sent his personal physicians to tend to Richard's lingering battle wounds and provided safe conduct for all Christian pilgrims. As the English fleet prepared to depart Acres Harbor weeks later, Richard stood alone at the stern of his flagship, watching the receding skyline of the city he'd fought so hard to take. The Holy Land had changed him in ways he didn't yet understand. The proud Crusader king who had arrived 3 years earlier would return home a different man. Across the hills, Saladin rode toward Damascus, his body racked with the fevers that would eventually claim his life just months after the treaty. Their agreement at Ramla would hold through the stipulated 3 years and beyond, becoming a template for future Christian-Muslim coexistence in the Levant. But as Richard's sails disappeared over the horizon and Saladin's coughing fits grew worse, the people of Palestine, Muslim, Christian, and Jew alike, could only wonder what new storms the next tide of history might bring. The two great leaders had made peace, but the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Always waiting. The stones of Jerusalem remembered countless conquerors, and they would remember this moment too, when the lion's roar faded to a whisper, and the Sultan's sword finally rested in its scabbard. For now, the fractured crusade, when kings clashed in the Holy Land, the Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the battered walls of Acre as two monarchs who had once sworn oaths of brotherhood now stood divided by ambition and pride. Richard Plantagenet, his massive frame encased in sweat-streaked armor, towered over the slight figure of Philip Augustus in the ruined Great Hall that had once belonged to the city's Saracen governor. The air between them crackled with tension thicker than the smoke still rising from the siege engines outside. Richard's laughter boomed through the cavernous space, echoing off the intricately carved stone walls now defaced with Crusader graffiti. "You dare claim equal spoils?" The Lionheart's voice carried the full weight of his contempt as he gestured toward the piles of treasure being catalogued by scribes in the corner. His gauntlet hand swept past casks of Syrian gold, bolts of Damascene silk, and jeweled reliquaries looted from mosques. Your men spent more time hiding in their tents than fighting on the walls. Philip's normally pale complexion flushed an angry red beneath his carefully trimmed beard. The French king's delicate fingers, more accustomed to holding a treaty quill than a broadsword, tightened around his jeweled goblet until the silver threatened to buckle. Around them, knights from both courts shifted uncomfortably, hands drifting toward sword hilts in unconscious reflex. The insult cut deeper because it held more than a grain of truth. While Richard had personally led the assault on Acre's seaward gates, scaling ladders under a hail of Greek fire, Philip had directed his forces from the relative safety of a shielded siege tower, his chronic ill health, whether genuine or conveniently timed, keeping him from the bloodiest fighting. Outside the makeshift royal court, the tension between their armies played out in increasingly violent displays. Near the ruined fountain house where Saracen women had once gathered water, a group of Richard's notorious Brabantine mercenaries taunted French knights by waving captured Seljuk banners just out of reach. One particularly bold English longbowman had nailed a pair of ornate French gauntlets to the door of a bathhouse with a crudely carved inscription, "Forgotten at the assault," like their owners. The rivalry extended far beyond battlefield slights. Back in Europe, while Richard had been mortgaging his kingdom to fund the Crusade, Philip had been quietly seizing Plantagenet lands along the Loire Valley. Now, standing amid the wreckage of conquered Acre, both men knew their fragile alliance would shatter the moment the last Saracen stronghold fell. The unspoken truth hung heavier than the humid coastal air: they were allies of convenience, bound by papal decree rather than genuine camaraderie. In the German camp beyond the city's northern walls, Duke Leopold V of Austria watched the unfolding drama with the detached amusement of a man who had already lost too much to care. His forces, what remained of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's once mighty army after its disastrous march through Anatolia, were too depleted to matter in this royal pissing contest. Yet when he dared raise his red and white banner beside those of the kings on Acre's conquered battlements, Richard's men had torn it down and thrown it into a latrine trench. The humiliation burned hotter than the Palestinian sun, and Leopold's subsequent departure would have consequences none could yet foresee. The cracks in Crusader leadership extended far beyond the royal tents. In the Temple district, where the military orders had commandeered a former madrasa for their headquarters, Grand Master Robert de Sable of the Templars stood nose to nose with Garnier de Nablus of the Hospitallers. Their argument over strategy had begun civilly enough over breakfast but now threatened to come to blows. "The road to Jerusalem lies open," de Sable insisted, his fist slamming onto a map of the Holy Land, sending chess pieces representing their forces tumbling. "Every day we delay gives that fox Saladin time to reinforce the city." Garnier, his face still bearing the fresh scar from an Acre arrow, shook his head vehemently. "Without securing Jaffa first, our supply lines would stretch thinner than a beggar's purse. We'd be besieging Jerusalem while starving ourselves." Their debate grew so heated that serving boys edged toward the exits, fearing the flash of drawn daggers. Only the sudden arrival of a messenger bearing news of Saladin's movements prevented what might have become the first armed clash between the orders. Meanwhile, in the former Saracen governor's palace, another power struggle played out with quieter but no less dangerous implications. Guy de Lusignan, the nominal king of Jerusalem by virtue of his dead wife's claim, paced the mosaic floors like a caged lion. His rival, Conrad of Montferrat, had already begun styling himself as the true monarch, his agents spreading whispers through the Crusader camps that Guy's incompetence had lost the kingdom to Saladin at Hattin. Richard found himself torn between the claimants in a political quagmire that proved more challenging than any battlefield. Conrad was undeniably the better commander, his defense of Tyre had become the stuff of legend. But Guy had been properly anointed and crowned, and the intricate web of feudal obligations that bound European nobility couldn't be lightly cast aside. The Plantagenet's solution was characteristically blunt. He recognized both men's claims, ensuring neither would gain supremacy while conveniently maintaining his own influence as power broker. The tension reached its zenith during the division of Acre's spoils. When Philip demanded half the city's treasure despite his forces comprising barely a quarter of the crusading army, Richard's response became instant legend. The Lionheart personally heaved a chest of Saracen gold coins across the hall, the heavy coffer skidding to a stop at Philip's silk-shod feet. "Take your pittance then, little king," Richard growled, his use of the diminutive deliberate and dripping with contempt. The insult would fester in Philip's mind like an infected wound, its poison spreading through French court politics long after the king abandoned the crusade weeks later, sailing home under cover of darkness to begin openly seizing Richard's continental holdings. Even the common soldiers took sides in these royal disputes, the camps dividing along linguistic and national lines. In the makeshift taverns along Acre's ruined waterfront, where enterprising locals sold watered wine from broken cisterns, English longbowmen and Norman knights traded increasingly elaborate boasts about their king's prowess. "Did you see Lord Richard on the scaling ladder?" a grizzled English sergeant asked his companions, flecks of spittle flying with each exaggerated gesture. 3 Saracens came at him with spears, and he took their heads with a single swing. The heathen blood rained down like Pentecostal fire. At a nearby table, French men-at-arms muttered into their cups about the Plantagenet upstart and his bastard mercenaries. The German contingent, nursing their collective wounded pride, drank in sullen silence, their occasional grumbles about English arrogance doing little to mask their impotent fury. The fractured command structure nearly proved disastrous during the grueling march south along the coast. At Arsif, when Saladin's forces launched their devastating ambush from the dense orchards, the French contingents initially refused to maintain the disciplined defensive formations Richard had drilled into them. Only the Lionheart's personal intervention, galloping along the buckling lines with his great axe held high and his famous roar cutting through the din of battle, prevented a complete rout. His fury afterward became the stuff of campfire tales. He personally stripped 3 French knights of their rank, snapping their swords across his armored knee before the assembled army. As the crusade wore on, the infighting took stranger and more Byzantine turns. When Conrad of Montferrat began secret negotiations with Saladin, offering to become the Sultan's vassal in exchange for recognition as King of Jerusalem, Richard responded by backing Guy even more publicly. The Plantagenet solution was as pragmatic as it was unorthodox. He sold Cyprus, which he'd conquered en route to Acre, to the hapless Guy, creating a new power base to counter Conrad's influence in Tyre. The final act of this tragicomedy came with Conrad's shocking assassination in Tyre's sun-dappled streets. 2 assassins struck in broad daylight, their curved daggers finding the gaps in the would-be king's armor with chilling precision. In his death throes, Conrad allegedly whispered that Richard had ordered the hit, a charge the English king vehemently denied even as his enemies seized upon it. The truth died with Conrad, but the suspicion further poisoned relations among the Crusaders, leaving Richard isolated at the very moment he needed unity most. In the end, these internal conflicts cost the Third Crusade its ultimate objective more decisively than any Saracen army. When Richard stood at Beit Nuba, the towers of Jerusalem visible in the distance, it wasn't Saladin's defenses that stopped him, it was the cold realization that without unified leadership, any captured city would become another flashpoint for Christian infighting. The Lionheart's famous tears upon turning away from the holy city weren't just for lost glory, but for the bitter understanding that even the greatest warrior of his age couldn't overcome the petty ambitions and pride that divided Christendom's leaders. As the crusade sputtered to its inconclusive end, the departing European armies carried home not just relics and scars, but lasting grudges that would shape continental politics for generations. Richard's subsequent imprisonment in Austria, Philip's relentless land grabs in Normandy, and the continued squabbling over the Jerusalemite crown all stemmed from those heated days in the Levant when Christian kings forgot their common purpose in pursuit of personal glory. The Holy Land had become a merciless mirror, reflecting back at Europe its own fractured nature, a lesson no one truly heeded. For even as Saladin's truce held, new armies were already gathering in the West, their leaders having learned nothing from the failures of cooperation that doomed the Third Crusade. The same rivalries would play out again on the same blood-soaked soil, the names changing but the story remaining tragically the same. In the centuries to come and high above the carnage, the relentless Middle Eastern sun continued its indifferent journey across the sky, baking the bones of fallen warriors from both faiths into the dust of history. The burning sands of Hattin. The morning sun rose like a burning brand over the Palestinian hills, its merciless heat already baking the cracked earth. Where Richard the Lionheart's army made their desperate stand. The English king wiped sweat from his brow with a gauntlet hand, the metal scalding hot from hours under the relentless sun. Behind him, his knights sat slumped in their saddles, their once gleaming armor now dulled by dust and dried blood. The magnificent warhorses that had carried them across Europe stood with heads bowed, their flanks heaving, tongues swollen from thirst. "Water!" croaked Sir William de Bars, his voice barely audible over the buzzing of flies swarming the dead. The veteran knight's lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. No one answered his plea. Saladin's scorched earth tactics had left the surrounding land barren, every well poisoned, every spring guarded by his swift-moving cavalry. The river of living waters, which Christian maps promised would refresh them, proved to be nothing but a dry riverbed strewn with bones. In the Muslim camp barely a mile away, Saladin sat beneath a canopy of striped silk, watching the Christian forces wither under nature's assault. His physician and chronicler Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad offered him a goblet of chilled sherbet, the condensation dripping down the silver sides. "Allah withers their strength before we ever draw our swords," Saladin murmured, his sharp eyes missing nothing, not the way the Crusader banners drooped in the windless air, nor how the infantry had begun digging frantically in the dry riverbed, hoping to find even a trickle of water beneath the parched surface. The memory of Acre still haunted both armies. For 2 interminable years, the Crusaders had clung to their siege works around the coastal city, watching generation after generation of reinforcements arrive only to perish, some by Saracen arrows, others by the slow rot of dysentery that turned strong men into skeletal wraiths. The German knight Marquard von Anweiler could still smell the stench if he closed his eyes, the sweet, sickly odor of gangrenous flesh mixed with the acrid smoke of Greek fire. He remembered digging mass graves until his hands blistered, tossing in friend and foe alike as the Mediterranean sun baked them all equally. Now, standing on this godforsaken plain, the survivors of that nightmare found themselves trapped in an even worse predicament. At least at Acre there had been the sea, brackish and undrinkable, but something. Here in this wasteland, even the vultures circled higher, as if knowing these walking corpses weren't worth the descent. In the Crusader command tent, Richard paced like a caged lion, his famous temper fraying with each passing hour. Maps lay scattered across the campaign table, their edges curling from the heat. "We dig deeper," he growled to his assembled commanders, slamming a fist down hard enough to make the goblets jump. "There must be water somewhere beneath this damned ground." But the local guides exchanged nervous glances. They knew what the Europeans refused to accept: the water table here ran deeper than any siege well could reach. The same sun that had bleached their bones white now mocked them from a cloudless sky. Out in the camp, discipline began unraveling. Norman and Angevin knights brawled over sips from a single wineskin. A group of Flemish mercenaries had taken to licking the morning dew from their shields. The Hospitallers moved through the ranks, offering what little medical aid they could, mostly just cutting away gangrenous limbs or administering last rites. Then came the moment that broke the army's spirit. A young squire, driven mad by thirst, broke ranks and ran screaming toward the Muslim lines, his arms outstretched in supplication. Before he'd covered half the distance, a dozen Saracen arrows found their mark. The boy crumpled to the dust, his blood soaking instantly into the thirsty ground. Richard watched the scene unfold from the ridge, his blue eyes burning with a mixture of fury and despair. He turned to his closest advisors, the grizzled Templar Robert de Sable, the ever-loyal Mercadier, and his childhood friend William Longchamp. "We fight our way out at dawn," he declared, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Better to die on our feet than wither like plants in this hell." As night fell, the temperature dropped with cruel irony. Men who had prayed for relief from the sun's torment now shivered in their sweat-dampened tunics. The lucky ones slept fitfully. Others simply stared hollow-eyed at the stars, too exhausted even for fear. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone voice began singing the Crusader hymn Veni Creator Spiritus. Others gradually joined in, the melody rising weakly at first, then gaining strength as it spread through the camp. Richard stood listening at the entrance to his tent, the words stirring memories of cooler lands and greener fields. For the first time since leaving England, he allowed himself to wonder if he would ever see those shores again. Dawn brought no mercy. The sun rose like the wrath of God itself, bleaching the color from the world. Richard's army formed their battle lines with mechanical precision, too drained for fear or fervor. When the Muslim drums began their ominous rhythm, it almost came as a relief. At least the waiting would be over. The battle that followed was less a clash of armies than a slow, inevitable unraveling. The Crusader charge, once the terror of Christendom, faltered before it even reached enemy lines. Horses collapsed mid-gallop. Knights in full armor simply toppled from their saddles, too weak to lift their swords. Richard himself fought like a man possessed, his great two-handed sword Holt carving through the enemy ranks, but even his legendary strength couldn't turn the tide. By midday, it was over. The few surviving Crusaders stood in isolated groups, backs together, surrounded on all sides. Richard, his surcoat torn and bloodied, raised his visor to survey the wreckage of his army. The field was littered with the dead and dying, their banners trampled into the dust. In that moment, he understood what true defeat tasted like, not the sharp bitterness he'd expected, but a hollow, aching emptiness. Saladin's terms were surprisingly merciful. The common soldiers would be enslaved, but the nobles could ransom themselves. Richard himself was treated with honor, brought before the Sultan in his lavish tent. The two men regarded each other across the divide of faith and culture, one a king raised in palaces, the other a warrior forged in the desert. "You fought bravely," Saladin said through his interpreter. "But even the lion must bow to the will of Allah." Richard, ever proud, refused to sit until offered a chair. "This isn't over," he replied, though both men knew otherwise. The Third Crusade had reached its bitter end not with a glorious charge, but with a whimper of exhaustion. As the surviving Crusaders were marched away, some to captivity, others to an uncertain future, the desert wind began to erase all traces of their passing. Sand drifted over bodies and broken weapons alike. Within days, only the bones would remain, and soon after, even they would be swallowed by the relentless desert. The Holy Land remained unconquered. The dream of Jerusalem faded like a mirage in the desert heat. And Richard the Lionheart, the mightiest warrior of his age, began the long journey home not as a conqueror, but as a man who had learned the limits of even a king's power. Somewhere in the hills, an old Bedouin shepherd watched the departing armies and murmured to his grandson, "They came for stones, but forgot that God lives in the heart, not in walls." The boy didn't understand, but he would remember the words long after the Crusaders had become just another story told around campfires, and high above, the same indifferent sun that had watched over countless such battles continued its eternal journey across the sky, its light falling equally on victor and vanquished alike. The Lion's Gambit. Richard's web of alliances in the Holy Land. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the crowded docks of Messina as Richard the Lionheart stood aboard his flagship, watching the last of the Sicilian mercenaries load their gear. The salty tang of the sea mixed with the stench of sweating men and animals, creating a pungent aroma that would linger in their nostrils for weeks to come. His newly forged alliance with Tancred of Sicily had cost him dearly in gold, but the additional ships and supplies might prove the difference between victory and starvation in the Holy Land. Below deck, the constant clang of hammers on armor echoed through the wooden hull as smiths worked to repair damaged gear. Richard could hear his trusted lieutenant, William de Bars, arguing with a group of Genoese sailors about storage space. The alliance with the Italian maritime republics was already proving troublesome. Their captains demanded double the agreed payment upon seeing the size of Richard's warhorses. "We should have taken the land route like Barbarossa," muttered Baldwin de Bethune, wiping sweat from his brow. Richard's answering laugh boomed across the deck. "And end up drowned in some Anatolian river? No, my friend. The sea is our path to glory." His confidence belied the unease in his gut. The news from the east grew worse by the day. Acre remained under siege, Philip of France was already en route, and Saladin's forces controlled nearly every strategic pass between the coast and Jerusalem. The first test of Richard's diplomatic skills came sooner than expected. When a storm scattered his fleet near Cyprus, the ship carrying his sister Joan and betrothed Berengaria ran aground on the island's rocky shores. The self-proclaimed Emperor Isaac Comnenos, seeing an opportunity, took them hostage. Richard's response would become legendary. He landed his forces at Limassol with the morning tide, his knights waiting ashore in full armor as the Cypriot defenders gaped in astonishment. By noon, he'd routed Isaac's army. By nightfall, the two rulers met in a torchlit grove outside Famagusta. As the Cypriot sprawled in the dust. "Now you'll learn what happens to those who cross the Lionheart." Yet even in victory, Richard showed his political acumen. He allowed Isaac to surrender with honor, though the silver chains he paraded the deposed ruler in were decidedly less honorable, and immediately set about wooing the local nobility. The Cypriot bishops were flattered with gifts of captured Byzantine relics. The merchants were promised preferential trade terms. The common people received reduced taxes. Within weeks, Richard had transformed a hostile territory into a vital supply base and strategic asset. The island's wheat would feed his armies, its ports would shelter his fleets, and its location would allow him to control the sea lanes to Acre. It was a masterclass in turning conquest into cooperation. When Richard finally arrived at the siege of Acre, the complex dance of alliances grew even more intricate. The French camp flew banners bearing the fleur-de-lis alongside those of the Duke of Burgundy. The Germans, what remained of them after their disastrous overland march, clustered around Leopold of Austria's tattered standard. The Italian contingents kept to themselves near the harbor, their pavilions ostentatious amidst the general squalor of the siege camp. Richard's first meeting with Philip Augustus was a study in barely concealed hostility. The French king, slight and pale compared to Richard's sun-bronzed vitality, received him in a tent draped with exquisite Parisian tapestries. "You're late," Philip remarked, sipping watered wine. Richard grinned, deliberately tracking mud across the priceless carpets. "I was busy acquiring an island, cousin. You should try it sometime, better than sitting here picking at your food like an old woman." The tension between them was palpable, but necessity forced an uneasy cooperation. Together with Leopold, they established a joint war council that quickly devolved into bickering over every decision. Richard favored immediate assault, Philip preferred methodical siege engines, and Leopold just wanted to go home. It was during one particularly heated argument that Richard made his move. When Leopold protested the placement of his banners, Richard personally tore them down and threw them in a latrine trench. The message was clear: there would be one dominant voice in this crusade, and it belonged to England. Yet Richard understood the value of strategic alliances. With the military orders, he cultivated particularly close ties. In the torchlit crypt beneath the Templar headquarters at Acre, he and Grand Master Robert de Sable shared a ritual cup of wine mixed with blood, a symbolic bond stronger than any parchment treaty. "Your men will have the vanguard at Arsuf," Richard promised. "And when Jerusalem is ours, the Temple Mount will be yours to purify." The Hospitallers received different promises. Richard funded their infirmaries and in return received their network of spies throughout Saladin's territories. Their master, Garnier de Nablus, proved an invaluable source of intelligence about Muslim troop movements, but Richard's most dangerous alliance was with Conrad of Montferrat, the ambitious ruler of Tyre. Their meeting in a seaside villa was a masterpiece of political theater. Conrad, darkly handsome and fluent in Arabic, proposed a radical vision: "Recognize me as King of Jerusalem, and I'll deliver you the city without another battle." Richard's eyes narrowed. "And how exactly would you accomplish that?" The unspoken answer hung between them. Conrad had been negotiating secretly with Saladin. Rather than denounce this as treason, Richard saw opportunity. He agreed to support Conrad's claim, while quietly ensuring Guy de Lusignan remained a viable alternative. The boldest proposed alliance never came to fruition, but its mere suggestion sent shockwaves through both camps. Through intermediaries, Richard floated the idea of marrying his sister Joan to Saladin's brother Al-Adil, with Jerusalem as their joint capital. When word leaked, the outcry from both Christians and Muslims nearly cost Richard his command, yet it was with the Bedouin tribes that Richard displayed his most innovative alliance building. In the moonlit desert beyond Ascalon, he met their sheiks without armor, bearing gifts of Damascus steel blades. These desert warriors cared nothing for crusades, only golden vengeance against Saladin's tax collectors. Their knowledge of hidden wells and secret passes would prove invaluable during the march south. As the campaign wore on, Richard's network of alliances began to fray. Philip's abrupt departure left the French contingent leaderless and resentful. Leopold's wounded pride festered into outright hostility. Even Conrad's usefulness ended abruptly when assassins' blades cut him down in a Tyre alleyway. In the end, standing before Jerusalem's impregnable walls, Richard faced the hard truth: no amount of alliances could overcome the fundamental divisions plaguing the Crusader forces. The Italians wanted trade concessions, the Germans wanted to go home, and the local barons squabbled over long-forgotten slights. His final act before departing the Holy Land was characteristic, a lavish feast in Jaffa where former enemies broke bread together one last time. As dawn painted the sea gold, Richard raised a cup in toast to alliances, however brief, however flawed. May our enemies never know whom we'll turn to next. The lesson of Richard's diplomatic web would echo through the centuries, that in war, even the most unlikely alliances can shift the balance, but only if woven with both steel and silver, threats and promises, in equal measure. And as his ships disappeared over the horizon, the people of Outremer were left to wonder, had the Lionheart been a master strategist, or had he simply played at alliances until even he could no longer tell friend from foe? The answer, like the man himself, remained complex and contradictory, a king who could conquer an island in days but couldn't hold the loyalty of his own allies, a warrior who understood the value of both the sword and the handshake, a lion who roared loudest when cornered. His legacy of alliances would be studied by generals and diplomats for centuries, but perhaps the truest lesson was this: in the Holy Land, all alliances were temporary, written in sand rather than stone, waiting for the next great tide to wash them away. The Lion and the Duke. A clash of titans in the Holy Land. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the battered walls of Acre as the two most unlikely of allies stood face to face in the ruined Great Hall of the city's former governor. Richard Plantagenet, his massive frame encased in sweat-streaked armor, towered over the slight figure of Leopold V, Duke of Austria. The air between them crackled with tension thicker than the smoke still rising from the siege engines outside. "You dare raise your banner beside mine?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet, his blue eyes burning with barely contained fury. His gauntlet hand rested on the hilt of his great sword, the golden lions on his crimson cloak seeming to snarl in the flickering torchlight. Leopold, his own surcoat bearing the red and white stripes of Austria, stood his ground despite the height difference. "My men bled just as yours did for this city," he countered, his German accent thickening with anger. The confrontation had been brewing since the disastrous march through Anatolia, where Leopold's forces, what remained of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's once mighty army, had arrived at Acre exhausted and demoralized. Richard, fresh from his conquest of Cyprus, had treated them more like beggars than allies, withholding supplies, and assigning them the most dangerous siege positions. Now, with the city finally fallen after 2 grueling years, the tension had erupted over something seemingly trivial: banner placement. Leopold had ordered his standard raised beside those of Richard and Philip Augustus atop Acre's main tower, a symbolic claim to shared victory. Richard saw it as unforgivable presumption from a mere duke. Richard's fist connected with Isaac's jaw before he could finish. "You're a pirate who got lucky," he growled. The memory of Richard personally cutting down Leopold's banner with his own battle axe would haunt both men for years to come. The image of the red and white standard fluttering down into the filth of Acre streets, where English archers promptly used it to wipe their boots, became a symbol of the growing rift between the Crusader factions. That night, in the privacy of his tent, Leopold penned furious letters to the remaining German nobility. The parchment nearly tore under his quill's pressure as he wrote, "The English king treats us no better than Saladin treats his dogs." His advisors warned against sending it, but Leopold was beyond caution. "Let him know my thoughts," he growled, sealing the letter with his signet ring. Meanwhile, in the lavish quarters he'd commandeered from a captured Saracen noble, Richard regaled his knights with exaggerated tales of the Austrian upstart. His laughter boomed through the torchlit hall as he mimicked Leopold's accent and recounted how the Duke's forces had hesitated during the final assault. "He fights like a merchant counting coins," Richard declared, raising his goblet and toast. The assembled knights roared with laughter, none noticing the quiet Templar in the corner who slipped away to report the insults back to Leopold. The final insult came during the division of spoils. While French and English coffers overflowed with Saracen gold, the Austrians received barely enough supplies to sustain their decimated forces. When Leopold confronted him in Acre's former mosque, now hastily consecrated as a chapel, Richard didn't even bother to rise from his prayers. "I reward those who prove their worth in battle," the Lionheart said without turning, "not those who hide behind titles." Leopold's departure from Acre days later went almost unnoticed amidst the victory celebrations. But Richard's network of spies, including clever Genoese merchants and even a few turncoat Saracens, soon reported troubling news. The Austrian duke hadn't sailed for home, but for Tyre, where Conrad of Montferrat, Richard's political rival, held court. The plot thickened when coded messages began passing between Leopold and Emperor Henry VI, Richard's sworn enemy back in Germany. A particularly damning letter, intercepted by Hospitaller spies, spoke of the English problem and appropriate containment. Richard's response was characteristically bold. He ordered Leopold's remaining supporters in Acre arrested and their possessions seized. "Let the mouse conspire with the snake," he told his worried advisers while examining maps for the march on Jerusalem. "I have a war to win." But Leopold would have his revenge in the most unexpected way. 2 years later, on a chill December morning in 1192, a group of Austrian knights burst into a modest inn near Vienna. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Otto von Traun, tore the hood from a tall traveler to reveal the unmistakable features of Richard Plantagenet. "My lord the Duke remembers Acre well," von Traun sneered as he bound the king's hands with rough rope. The dungeon at Dürnstein Castle where Leopold imprisoned his royal captive became the stuff of legend. Hewn from the living rock of a cliff above the Danube, its walls wept with constant condensation. The chill seeped into bones, and the only light came from a narrow slit high in the stones. Here, the Lionheart who had faced down Saladin's finest found himself at the mercy of a slighted duke's vengeance. Yet even in captivity, Richard turned the tables. When Leopold visited his prisoner, expecting groveling, he found the English king playing chess with the jailer and winning. "Your game is as weak as your politics," Richard remarked casually, capturing Leopold's queen with a knight. The duke left in a rage, slamming the heavy oak door hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. The ransom demand was staggering 150,000 marks, nearly 3 times England's annual revenue. But Richard's mother, the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine, moved mountains to raise the sum. Churches were stripped of silver, nobles taxed into poverty, and England's treasury emptied to buy her son's freedom. The aftermath of their feud left deep scars on European politics. Pope Celestine III excommunicated Leopold for imprisoning a crusader, though the ban was later lifted after the duke's lavish donations to church coffers. Richard, though free, would spend the rest of his reign battling Philip Augustus, who had used his captivity to seize Plantagenet lands in France. Fate delivered its final judgment on Leopold in 1194. During a tournament near Graz, his horse stumbled and fell, crushing the duke's leg. The wound festered, and gangrene set in. As he lay dying in agony, servants claimed he cried out for absolution, haunted by visions of a golden lion. Richard, when informed of his old enemy's death, reportedly said only, "God's justice moves slowly, but never misses its mark." The tale of their feud became legend, immortalized in minstrel songs and chronicles. It served as a caution to princes about the dangers of pride and the long memory of kings. For in the end, both men lost more than they gained, Leopold his honor, Richard his ransom gold, and the crusade its last hope of unity. And so the Lion and the Duke passed into history, their story a reminder that even the mightiest warriors are but mortal men, and that the wounds of pride often cut deeper than any sword. Blood on the walls of Acre. Richard the Lionheart and his prisoners of war. The first light of dawn crept like a thief across the blood-stained plains before Acre's shattered walls, illuminating a scene that would haunt the dreams of men for generations. Richard Plantagenet, his massive frame encased in armor that still bore the dents and scratches of yesterday's final assault, stood motionless atop a makeshift platform constructed from broken siege engines. Below him, stretching as far as the eye could see, thousands of Muslim prisoners knelt in the dirt, their hands bound behind their backs with strips of leather that cut cruelly into flesh. The morning mist carried the metallic tang of blood from the recent battle, mixing with the stench of fear and despair rising from the captives. The young squire, his face still soft with youth, approached the English king with trembling hands, offering a scroll bearing Saladin's latest message. Richard's calloused fingers unfurled the parchment with deliberate slowness, his ice-blue eyes scanning the elegant Arabic script that his interpreter hastily translated. The terms were clear: Saladin would not meet Richard's demands for prisoner exchange, nor would he surrender the true cross captured at Hattin. The king's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the fury building within his broad chest. "Bring forth the garrison commanders first," Richard commanded, his voice carrying across the silent field with the weight of doom. The order set in motion a grim procession that would last from sunrise to sunset. First came the military leaders, proud men who had defended Acre with desperate courage, now forced to their knees before this foreign king. Richard studied each face with the detached interest of a butcher assessing livestock, occasionally nodding for a particular prisoner to be pulled from the line and dragged toward the nearby hills where Saladin's scouts watched helplessly from a distance. Among the captives, a boy of no more than 14 summers clutched at the tattered remains of his father's robe. The elder man, once a respected merchant in Acre's bustling markets, now bore the blank stare of a man who had seen too much. "Be strong, my son," he whispered in Arabic, though his voice broke on the words. The boy, whose name was Karim and who had never held a sword before being pressed into the city's desperate defense, could only nod mutely as the Crusader guards began separating families with brutal efficiency. The executions began at midday, when the sun stood directly overhead and cast no shadows to hide the carnage. Richard's chosen executioners, huge Flemish mercenaries with arms like tree trunks and faces hardened by a dozen campaigns, moved methodically down the lines of prisoners. Their great two-handed swords rose and fell with mechanical precision, each stroke sending another head tumbling into the growing pile at the base of the hill. The blood flowed so freely that it formed rivulets in the dusty earth, carving miniature canyons that would remain visible for weeks after. "You dare threaten my family?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet, his hand resting on the hilt of his great sword. Isaac, though defeated, remained defiant. "I am emperor here by right." From his vantage point, Richard watched it all with the same intensity he brought to a game of chess. Only the occasional tightening of his grip on the armrest of his makeshift throne betrayed any emotion. When a particularly brave emir spat at his feet and cursed him in fluent Latin, the king merely raised an eyebrow before gesturing for the man to be taken to the front of the line. "Let his God recognize him first," Richard remarked dryly to his assembled commanders, several of whom crossed themselves at the words. Yet even as the slaughter continued, strange moments of mercy punctuated the horror. An elderly physician, his hands still stained with the blood of patients he'd tended during the siege, was pulled from the line and brought before Richard. The king studied the old man's face for a long moment before speaking in halting Arabic learned during his time in the Holy Land. "You treated Christian and Muslim alike within those walls," Richard stated, more observation than question. When the physician nodded wearily, the king gestured to one of his knights. "This one comes with us. His skills may prove useful." As the day wore on, the selection process became more arbitrary. Some prisoners were spared because they possessed skills Richard's army needed: blacksmiths, armorers, interpreters. Others bought their lives with information about Saladin's troop movements or the locations of hidden treasure within Acre's ruins. A few, like the young boy Karim, survived through sheer caprice when Richard's gaze happened to fall upon their terrified faces at just the right moment. "That one's too small to be any threat," the king muttered, waving a hand dismissively. "Put him to work in the kitchens." By nightfall, when the last of the executions had been carried out and the surviving prisoners had been marched away in chains, Richard retired to the tent that had once belonged to Acre's Muslim governor. The luxurious pavilion, with its silk hangings and intricate mosaics, stood in stark contrast to the carnage outside. The king sat heavily in a carved wooden chair, accepting a goblet of wine from his squire with a grunt of thanks. Around him, his commanders waited in uneasy silence, none daring to speak first. It was the Templar Grand Master who finally broke the stillness. "Saladin will retaliate for this, my liege." The old knight's voice was heavy with unspoken reproach. "The rules of war are written by victors," Richard interrupted sharply, his eyes flashing in the lamplight. "And today, we are victorious." He drained his cup in one long swallow before continuing. "Let Saladin rage. Let him swear vengeance. When next we meet in battle, his men will remember what happens to those who defy me, and their hands will shake." The following weeks proved Richard's prediction both right and wrong. Saladin did indeed retaliate, ordering the execution of captured Christian knights in a grim mirror of Richard's actions. Yet when the two armies met again at Arsuf, it was Richard who showed unexpected mercy, releasing hundreds of Muslim prisoners after his decisive victory. The apparent contradiction baffled both allies and enemies alike. In private, Richard explained his reasoning to his closest advisors. At Acre, I needed to break their spirit, he said while having his wounds dressed by the very physician he'd spared. At Arsuf, I needed to show them that surrender brings mercy. War is not just about killing, it's about knowing when to kill and when to stay your hand. The physician, Yusuf ibn Qasim, listened quietly as he applied a poultice to the deep gash in Richard's thigh. And what of tomorrow, my lord? The old man dared to ask. When you stand before Jerusalem's walls, will it be mercy or the sword that day? Richard's laughter filled the tent, startling the guards outside. That, my learned friend, depends entirely on how stubborn your sultan chooses to be. As the campaign wore on, Richard's treatment of prisoners became increasingly strategic. Skilled craftsmen were kept alive and put to work maintaining siege engines. Physicians were pressed into service tending Christian wounded. Ordinary soldiers who surrendered without resistance were often released after swearing oaths never to take up arms against the Crusaders again, oaths that many promptly broke, though Richard seemed not to care. Only two groups faced consistent, unrelenting brutality, the members of Saladin's elite Mamluk regiments and the feared Hashashin. When captured, these warriors could expect no mercy from the English king. The Mamluks, who had been responsible for some of the worst atrocities against captured Christians, were routinely executed in full view of their comrades. The Hashashin suffered even worse fates, with Richard personally overseeing their torture in hopes of learning the location of their mountain strongholds. Yet even in this darkness, moments of unexpected humanity emerged. On the march toward Jaffa, Richard's forces captured a Muslim woman trying to sneak food to her son, a wounded soldier hiding in the ruins of a village. When brought before the king, she spat in his face, an offense that should have meant instant death. Instead, Richard wiped his cheek and ordered both mother and son sent to Saladin's lines under flag of truce. Even lions protect their cubs, he told his astonished commanders by way of explanation. As the campaign stretched into its second year, Richard's prisoner policy became increasingly pragmatic. With supply lines stretched thin and disease ravaging both armies, maintaining large numbers of captives became impractical. More and more often, prisoners were simply disarmed and released, their weapons and armor added to the Crusaders' dwindling stores. Only in the final days before his departure from the Holy Land did Richard's true feelings about the whole bloody business surface. Sitting alone with his confessor on the cliffs above Jaffa, watching the Mediterranean waves crash against the rocks below, the king uncharacteristically dropped his guard. "Do you think God will forgive me for Acre, father?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The priest, a grizzled veteran of many campaigns, considered his answer carefully. "That depends, my son. Do you regret it?" Richard's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. "I regret that it was necessary," he said at last. "But given the same choice again, I would do the same. A king's first duty is to his people, not to his soul." The wind carried his words away, just as it would soon carry his ships back to England. Behind him, in makeshift prisons and work camps across the conquered territories, the survivors of his mercy and his wrath waited to see what fate would bring. Some would be ransomed. Some would escape. Some would die far from home, their bones left to bleach under the same sun that had watched their brothers fall before Acre's walls, and high above them all, the stars wheeled in their endless courses, bearing silent witness to the truth Richard himself had come to understand, that in war, there are no true victors, only those who bleed less than their enemies. The blood on his hands would never fully wash away, no matter how many years passed or how many priests absolved him. It was the price of kingship, and he paid it without flinching.